This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken begin today's show with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast, where they discuss habitat management with fire and how it impacts wildlife, specifically northern bobwhite quail. Rodrigo Onofre, K-State row crop plant pathologist, continues the show as he explains corn stunt and corn leafhoppers. He describes this new-to-Kansas disease and what growers need to keep an eye out for. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he encourages producers to continue using the recommended HPAI safety measures to be prepared if a new outbreak in Kansas occurs. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another part of the Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. You know, it's that fun time of year. I love the fall time. It starts to get a little bit chilly. I'm already wearing long sleeves because I'm a wuss, but tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about today, Drew.
After we did the episode on managing native grasslands for wildlife, one of our listeners reached out to Joe and said, hey, that's great that we see benefits from a habitat management standpoint, but what does fire actually do to the critters specifically? And so I thought I'd put some information together, and I don't think I talk about birds often enough, or we talk about birds often enough since we've got feathers in our title, so we thought we'd throw a little bit of bird content in here too with this episode.
When we light these areas on fire, you know, what is that doing to the animals that are out living in that prairie, for example?
Sure. So we do prescribe fires. A lot of the fire that we do is dormant season fire. So that fire oftentimes is occurring sometime between February and the middle of April. The vast majority of those critters escape the fire. There would be more direct mortality of some of the small mammal species that nest above ground. Most of the species that get in burrows below the ground aren't really affected by that fire passing over. They're more affected by the habitat changes that happen afterwards, as are the critters that can get out of the way of the fire. But there's a few of those small mammal species. You know, if we had a pretty big fire that was moving fairly quickly in some places, then yeah, there's going to be some direct mortality of a few rabbits and those sorts of critters. As we move more into the growing season, that's when we start to see more direct mortality from fires. Then we start to see some dead snakes. We're going to see a lot more dead insects and those sorts of things. We absolutely see some direct mortality of the bird species that nest early, and not necessarily the adults very often, but more often the nests of those bird species. The really important thing to remember about that is that they can re-nest, and they're also dependent on those habitat conditions that are the result of the fire that killed that nest.
So it sounds like maybe we want to try to burn earlier. Is that correct? Or is it okay to do a May or later fire, right? What does that look? Is some fire better than none, or is there a cutoff date?
So I would say that this is one of those things where it absolutely depends on the species that you're talking about.
It depends. I love that answer.
Yeah, that's that most common answer in ecology, right?
That's right.
It depends. But generally speaking, if you want to avoid any mortality at all of a target critter or any potential mortality, then burning earlier is better. But it gets complicated. So the critter that I kind of wanted to focus on today, since we're trying to talk about birds anyway, is northern bobwhite quail. And a lot of people are interested in them. They've also suffered drastic declines throughout most of their range in North America, but the Great Plains is actually the area where they're doing the best, especially in areas where there's still some fire. Depending on the time of the growing season that a quail nest is initiated, they may or may not put that nest in a place where there's enough fuel there to carry a fire. So one of the things that they saw in a study in southwest Missouri that was looking at a bunch of different things, but prescribed fire and grazing was one of them, was that the earlier nests were in a unit that was going to be burned in August or that had those characteristics, had the same time since fire than an area that was going to be burned in like August. So those nests that were initiated in like May or early June. But those nests would have had their fate, meaning they either were preyed on, they failed for some other reason, or they hatched within 23 days. The nests that were initiated later, so July or August, those nests were in units that were not slated to burn that year because they had a longer time since fire. So quail are going to select areas that have some previous year's growth if they're those early nests. So for quail, growing season fire is fine as long as you're burning that stuff that's got a whole bunch of litter accumulated in it from a couple of years of previous growth.
Why would we want to do a fall burn?
There's been a growing body of research over the last 20 years or more, and some of this research has at least 20 years of data collection behind it. So very, very well-documented responses have shown that from a plant community standpoint, there's not really much of a difference if you burn any one day of the year over another. And the thing that I tell people is the time to burn is when you've got the weather conditions and a crew to be able to get it done. It doesn't really matter to the critters unless you're burning on an extremely large scale where you're going to remove all the cover across a very large area. It doesn't really matter to them when you burn. The reason that it can matter if you're burning on a really large scale is if we burn going into winter and we've got species that rely on that grass for cover, then you may remove all the cover from the area, and that could be detrimental.
So thinking about the quail a little bit, it sounds like, it might, again, individuals might have some negative responses, but as a whole, it's a good thing for them.
Yeah, and so thinking about, I wanted to talk about two specific studies, two that are sort of at the extreme of what we might see in the east and west of the Great Plains. So one was done out in western Oklahoma, and they monitored nests, so they got estimates of nest survival in grasslands, and during the course of their study, they were able to monitor nests that were in grasslands in areas that were burned this year, all the way out to areas that were burned 4 years ago. So 0 to 4 years if we're talking about years since fire. And the cool thing that they saw was that the highest nest survival occurred in areas that were burned about a year ago. So 13 to 24 months since fire. They saw about the same, just a little bit lower nest survival in that 24 to 36 months since fire. And they saw the lowest survival in the 3 to 4 years since fire, and then the 0 years since fire, the stuff that burned this year. So that shows a couple of things, right? One of them is that quail want some fire, right? They do best if there's fire on the landscape. They need to have that grass burned. And that's been shown across the entire range of quail. It's not just a Great Plains thing. Fire and quail go hand in hand. But they don't want to nest in the stuff that we burned this year if they can avoid it, and they don't want to nest in stuff that hadn't been burned for quite a while. They also saw that the quail that did nest in the areas that were burned this year nested around shrubs, and the quail that nested in areas that were longer time since fire nested away from shrubs. They nested in that herbaceous cover. So that's kind of a cool thing that they found too. And so that really reinforces to me that we need fire on the landscape for this bird.
You said there were two studies that you mentioned. What did the other one find?
Yeah, so the other one's out of southwest Missouri. They saw a really, really strong response of broods. So that's these chicks that have hatched this year. They're trying to grow up, and they need cover that would pass the tennis ball test. Okay, so that's where you can drop a tennis ball on the ground, and you could roll that around with your foot because the vegetation right at ground level is sparse enough to allow you to roll it, but you would have taller plants that are like brushing up against your thighs as you're walking around and rolling that ball, and you wouldn't be able to see the ball very well from above. So there's going to be lots of insects in that kind of cover. It also provides protection from predators that might try and come in from above and kill those chicks. Okay, so that's cover that would pass the tennis ball test. That's what broods need. And In that study, they found that brood survival increased from 21 to 84% as the availability of burned and grazed prairie increased within 50 meters of a brood's home range. Another thing that study found was that winter survival, and this is adults and broods combined, was higher as quail were able to be farther from trees. So from 0 to 200 meters from a tree, survival increased during the wintertime. So when we're thinking about trying to manage against trees in prairie, fire is the easiest way to do that, right? Fire on an interval that's relatively appropriate for the amount of rainfall that you get and the kind of prairie that you're in. There's other ways to do it, of course. We can go out there and we can cut trees down and spray the stumps. But without fire, we're going to have more trees that come in. And then the easiest way to remove those trees without fire is going to be to go through and broadcast spray a herbicide that's going to kill those trees. Mm-hmm. Well, what else do herbicides that kill trees kill?
Yeah, broadleafs and
broadleafs. Yeah, they're going to kill all the forbs too, and that's that critical component of the habitat that's out there for those broods. It's providing food for adults. It's providing those insects for the chicks, and it's providing cover for the chicks too. So it's really hard to manage for that habitat that we want in grasslands that aren't tilled without fire. Yeah. And really without grazing, too.
Well, Drew, thanks for chatting with us about fire today. I think a lot of good information there and a lot of good, tying into some past episodes and focusing it a little bit more on a little bit different direction. That was fun to listen to. So thanks for chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it.
That was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing corn stunt with K-State row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre. Rodrigo, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me over here today.
Rodrigo, what is corn stunt?
Well, yeah, that's a good question for all of us here in Kansas. Corn stunt has never been reported this far north, and it's a twofold, right? Because we're reporting the disease and as well the leafhopper.
And so where is it usually found? Just Oklahoma, Texas?
So it's been in the U.S., in Texas, Louisiana, California, and the southern states, Florida as well. However, the leafhopper, which it's the one that transmits the disease, we have never seen it this far north, right? So it's a new report, not just for the disease, but also for the leafhopper, right? Of course, we have other leafhoppers, such as the alfalfa leafhopper and several other ones, but this one, it's a very specific species, right? So it's called double maize, and it's the only species that will transmit the corn stunt spiroplasma.
Are there other concerns with this corn leafhopper?
Yes, because this leafhopper can transmit more than the corn stunt spiroplasma. There are other diseases that this specific leafhopper can transmit, right? We haven't detected yet here in Kansas, but it is certainly important to keep in mind that we might be seeing other diseases that can be transmitted by this leafhopper.
What does it look like?
So corn stunt, as the name says, right, if the infection is happening early in the season, we might see that stunted plants. However, if it's happening more later in the season, what we'll see is more that shifting coloration, right? It goes from green to purplish in about 30 days after the infection happens is when we start seeing the symptoms. And I think the majority of the symptoms that I seen here in Kansas was more the late season type of infection where it's more that purple color, which can be, when you think about deer damage, right? You snap that ear out, you have sugar accumulation, and the corn plant respond as being purple. However, this disease, it mimics that same scenario, right? But you can still find those plants with ears on it, right? But they're still turning purple.
Where are corn growers most likely to find it?
So the leafhopper, right now, it's pretty widespread across Kansas. And, of course, harvest is on the way. So a lot of producers are not going to be finding in the corn. And something to keep in mind, too, this leafhopper, it's known to reproduce in corn. However, it can survive in other species such as alfalfa, Johnson grass, wheat. Those are alternative hosts for this leafhopper.
Do we know very much about the life cycle of the corn leafhopper?
So it's a very important question, right? The nymphs will emerge every 2 to 3 days in temperatures around 80 to 90 degrees, so hot weather conditions, right? And then the corn leafhoppers will complete their development in just days, with development, I'd say, occurring more rapidly at warmer temperatures. The adults can survive between 30 to 80 days, and the females can put around 15 eggs per day and up to 600 eggs in their life cycle, right? So they can reproduce really fast.
What do these corn leafhoppers look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one of the things is we can identify them in the field, and for that, you're going to be looking into the leafhoppers, and they're very characteristic, and they have 2 dotted dark spots in between their eyes that will distinguish them from other species, right? And there is also more like a V shape on that first thoracic segment in the insect that also helps you to identify it in the field. And I'm talking a lot about insect and disease, right? This has been a project that entomology and plant pathology has been working together. Anthony Zukoff, stationed in Garden City, we have been working very close together and guiding us. So if you have questions as well, feel free to reach out to Anthony Zukoff there as well.
Where in Kansas is this being found?
So we went from 4 or 5 counties early September to 26 counties right now. So it's a long list. So I would recommend checking the e-update that we had this article there too. But I would say from northeast Kansas to southwest Kansas, we have confirmed several counties there, like the 26 counties, right, where this disease has been reported, right? And of course, all the corn, the majority of our corn right now is being harvested, so potentially this was much more wider spreader than what we managed to find. And one thing to keep in mind, too, is this disease can be found in field corn, but as well sweet corn, right? And sweet corns typically are planted early here in Kansas, but if you have like late planted sweet corn, too, it could definitely be an issue. And talk about late planted corn, right? Our late planted and double crop corn, I would say, are the scenarios where we're getting the biggest heat in terms of yield reduction. We have seen producers mentioning that they have lost several bushels in severe conditions caused by this disease. So, and high levels of incidence on the late planted corn. I'd say fields that were planted in June, central Kansas are definitely getting a heat because of this leafhopper and disease, right?
Is this something that producers need to go scout their field for right now, or really just if it's out there and what's done is done?
I think there's 2 folds to that question, right? It's important to know the distribution of the disease and leafhopper, and you can send a sample to the diagnostic lab if you still have green corn, or if you still want to confirm if you have the leafhopper or not, you can contact myself or Anthony Zukoff to verify if you have this specific leafhopper, right? It's always good to make sure if you know that we have. And as we go into the winter, right, as I said before, this disease was, it's being established in the southern states. We don't know if it will survive here in Kansas.
What about for next year?
So as we get ready for next year, right, we'll definitely be monitoring this leafhopper and see if, 1, will survive here in Kansas, and 2, how early will this really show up again, right? If we start picking up this leafhopper in April, May, it could definitely be a threat to corn production here. And when we think about South America, Argentina, Brazil, I think they have had severe yield loss there over the years caused by this disease specifically. Management is very challenging because we're talking about an insect, so thresholds are very minimum I would say their threshold right now is one leafhopper in the field. So you could have multiple insecticide application if this becomes a problem for us, even within one season, right? In terms of resistance, some of the hybrids are resistant to the leafhopper, but not as much to the disease. So it's a very challenging Spiroplasma disease, right? Our fungicides will not do anything towards it, right? Because it's not a fungi. So the main one would be an insecticide targeting that leafhopper.
So if people have any questions or think they might have in your field, really asking them to either get their corn tested or reach out to you guys at least?
Yes, absolutely. And again, if you're sending us samples, we are looking for green tissue, right? Not brown corn ready to harvest that's ready too late to test for this Spiroplasma, which is a bacterial-like organism, and the main difference is that it doesn't have a cell wall, right? So that's what we call like a Spiroplasma.
Are there any important tips or things you want to remind producers of if they are going to test their corn?
We only need the leaves at the moment and symptomatic leaves and ship that to the diagnostic lab. Of course, we always advise to send us the samples between Mondays and Wednesdays so it doesn't sit over the weekend in a truck. Get that sample to us. If
people are wanting to read more about corn stunt or corn leafhoppers, any recommendations?
So yes, check our latest e-update. I think that's really good information that we have it there. And again, feel free to reach out to either myself or Anthony Zukoff in the Southwest Research Station Center there too.
Rodrigo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Kansas State University row crop plant pathologist Rodrigo Onofre discussing corn stunt and corn leafhoppers. If you'd like to read more on this topic, one way you can do that is by checking out a recent Agronomy e-update article. This e-update article is titled Corn Stunt Spiroplasma, a New Threat to Kansas Corn. You can find it linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net or find it for yourself by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. If you'd like to reach out to Rodrigo, his email is onofre@ksu.edu. That is onofre@ksu.edu. If you'd like to reach out to Anthony Zukoff, his email is azukoff@ksu.edu. That is azukoff@ksu.edu. I will link their contact information also in today's show notes, as well as where you can find out more information about shipping in samples. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk for this week's Milk Lines.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. While Kansas hasn't seen a case of HPAI since mid-April, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages producers to follow best practices and be prepared in the event of a new outbreak.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers and give a quick update on HPAI in our dairy herds. Here in Kansas, everything has really been quiet over summer. April 17th was the last time we had a confirmed case here in Kansas. So as we look at what's going on across the country, though, that's not necessarily the case. In August, there was an outbreak that started in California, and that continues today. So as we look toward this fall and what we might be doing to protect our own herds here in Kansas, just wanted to update you on some of the things that we've discovered through research and other things that the animal health industry across the United States has been trying to do. So number one, as we look at the current spreads seem to be connected with the movement of animals into a new area from an area where the infection has been present. As we think about protecting our own herds moving forward, we
we need to be very mindful that a primary way that it appears that this virus moves into naive herds is from the movement of animals from an area that has had issues with the virus. Now, within the herd, it seems to spread rather rapidly through the milking parlor. So milking procedures become a primary way that we can prevent possibility of spread. And the primary thing we would need to do there is separate animals that are suffering from symptoms of the virus from other animals, keeping those animals in a separate group and milking them at the very last. Now, as we think about what we might do to protect our farms, there's some things that I think you need to take into consideration. If you are in the process of moving animals onto your farm from other places, please make sure that animals have been tested and are known to be free from the virus before you move them into your herd. As we think about moving those animals, the equipment that we use to move them can be a source of spread as well. So disinfecting trucks before we load and after we haul animals is very important. And that disinfectant should include a chemical, not just water. So just simply washing is not effective enough. There does need to be a disinfectant included in that wash as well. Many of you probably have concerns about migrating birds, and that was the way the virus originally passed to dairy herds. But as we look at what's going on today, it appears as though our greatest risk is due to the movement of animals, equipment, and or people onto our dairy from areas that have been previously infected. Now, if you want to think about what you're going to do should your herd become infected, I think it's important that you consider some things. Number one, a lot of times about 10% of our herd is impacted, and the best treatment that we have are fluids and electrolytes. So when you think about how you deliver those, many times on our farms, we just simply do that with a hand pump. And that's effective if we just have a few animals that we might be treating. But if you're talking about 10% of your herd and you're talking about multiple treatment days, you might want to consider a different type of pump other than a manual pump to deliver that electrolyte. Second thing you need to think about is supply of electrolytes. Many times farms in a particular region will use a similar source of supply, so sometimes those can be depleted fairly quickly due to the number of animals that we're treating. So having identified where you would get supplies from would be very important so that you can have supplies available should you need them on your farm. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers here in Kansas that while everything has been quiet for many months, there's still the possibility that we could see new outbreaks of HPAI, and it's important that we prepare ahead of time so that we can meet those challenges should it happen on our particular dairy farm.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.